So we know that rational economic agents take action as long as the benefits are greater than the costs. And this is individuals, this is firms, this is governments. Everyone does this implicitly. It's what we're doing. We're doing cost benefit analysis. But cost benefit analysis specifically often is used to refer to a specific approach to evaluating things. But really, it's just making more concrete what we do in our head all the time. If we do something, it's because the benefits are greater than cost. But if it's a government policy or a firm undertaking an investment, it's got to be on paper, it's got to be official, it's got to have the numbers. And so cost benefit analysis is, let's weigh these costs, let's weigh these benefits, and let's measure them. And we've talked in a different video about how we choose the discount rate, and that can make a big difference in what the costs and benefits are. There are a lot of other things, and this is sort of to emphasize that when we're valuing the cost and benefits of a government policy or even a firm's decision to do something, there are a lot of things that are hard to measure. And sometimes when we see those concrete numbers, we think, oh, this is very objective because it's numerical and we've calculated the cost and we've calculated the benefits. Sometimes it can be the choice of discount rate, but a lot of times there are things that we're measuring that don't have a clear market value, and we have to come up with some other way to value them. And there's not any real great way, right? Because they're not market valued. So we have to come up with things. And so I just want to talk just to give you an awareness of the sorts of things we do to measure these things. So when you see, here's the cost and here's the benefits, and it looks very official because there's numbers sometimes carried out to, $3,467,012, it makes it seem like it's very concrete. In a lot of cases, there are a lot of assumptions or a lot of, we're doing the best we can to get numbers. And so it's important because of that. And I'm not saying that people manipulate cost benefit analyses, but because a lot of these things are hard to measure, it would be easy to move things so that they kind of favor whatever position it is that you want to take. So because of that, it's important to be very careful in your when you're reading about, here's the cost and benefits of this, and clearly this is, you need to think about where those numbers came from and think about some of these things. So this isn't going to be an exhaustive, this is just a few things. Natural resources, how do you know what the Arctic wildlife is worth to you? What's the cost of drilling in the Arctic wildlife? We often, for valuing natural resources, use something called contingent valuation, or some other way of asking people their willingness to pay. That's sort of what contingent valuation is. We could teach a whole class on contingent valuation, but just there's an idea. So we don't know what's saving the whales worth to you, what's clean air worth to you, what's stopping climate change, and what's stopping climate change. The climate's going to change. So like what's reducing the increase in global temperature by 1 degree worth to you? Like how do you know that? How do you measure that? It's not something concrete. But if we're trying to figure out whether we should undertake a policy, we need some measure. So we ask people. The problem is, as you can guess, it's not necessarily going to be concrete. In some cases, it's manipulable or by some behavioral economic insights here. The endowment effect is one that says people are very often much less willing to pay to get something than they would have to be paid to give it up. So if you ask somebody, if we're going to turn this land into a wetland and preserve things, what would you be willing to pay to make that happen? And people are like, yeah, no, not so much. If there's a wetland there and you say, what would you have to be paid to give up this wetland? It's going to be a lot higher. Once people have something, how much they value if they have to give it up is a lot more than they'd be willing to pay to get it, which I mean is not unreasonable. But when you're trying to come up with what is a wetland worth, some sort of concrete measure for what is this wetland worth, it shouldn't really be the same whether you have it or you're going to get it. It's what it's worth. But given that the difference can be so big, it calls into question a lot of the validity, or you have to understand the endowment effect. So when you see an evaluation based on people's expressed willingness to pay, you have to think, is it something that they have already, or is it something that they're going to get, because their estimate may be biased very, very much. And so another, again, a thing from behavioral economics, it's a concept called anchoring and adjustment, where once you anchor on a value, then you adjust. And so there was a study about valuing whales, right? So how much do you value whales? People like whales a lot, right? People also like seals, but apparently people like whales more than they like seals. So if you just ask people, what are you willing to pay to save the whales? They'll give you a number. But if you ask, what are you willing to pay to save seals? They'll give you a number. And then if you ask them after that how much they're willing to pay to save whales, it's going to be a lot higher because they like whales better. So if you anchor them on seals, and then, because nobody knows how much they value seals or whales. I mean, let's be honest. So if you just ask whales, they'll give you some number. Seals will probably give you a fairly similar number, and then ask them whales after that, and they have to go up because they like the whales better. Not everyone, but in general, apparently they do. And so if you really want people to say they value whales, you ask seals first and then whales, and you'll get a lot higher valuation. And these are just a few examples of the insights behavioral economics has given us, that when you're asking people their valuation, there's a lot of ways that their evaluation may be biased in ways that maybe they don't even know. And it could be the case also that they're purposely being untruthful preference revelation. Sometimes they may not, you don't want this project going through, so you say, I value that wetland a lot more, or you do, and you say, I value having, an hour cut off my commute if we expand this highway by 3 lanes so much. Well, that's not a natural resource, but yeah, so if somebody's just asking you how much it's worth to you, and you know why they're asking, and you have a preference for what the cost benefit analysis is going to show, you have a strong incentive to not be truthful about what you're saying. Not saying a lot of people would do that, but yeah, people do that, right? I mean, it makes sense. But I think even more than any of that is that people just don't know. You can have all these mechanisms, but if you're asking people what is the Grand Canyon worth to them, right? You may never even visit the Grand Canyon, but knowing it's there and seeing pictures of it and understanding that thing is that there's some value to people in the Grand Canyon existence value, it's called. But how do you measure that? And so again, I'm not saying we can't use continued evaluation. We can't ask people things because we don't have a lot of better ways to do it. And then there's, you can teach a whole course, like I said, on how to get valuations for natural resources. And just pointing out some of the problems so that it's clear that we need to be careful when we're thinking about looking at numbers and making sure that we understand that what's behind concrete numbers are sometimes very subjective evaluations. And it's the same thing with valuing time. How do we value how much, if we didn't have the lead in the pipe in Flint, Michigan, what is that worth? Is it worth infinity? I mean, to the people who are harmed, yes, each individual life is infinitely valuable. But when we say, should we require cars to have airbags? Some lives will be saved, but there will be a cost. Is it worth it? And if we're going to decide that, if we're going to make that policy, we have to say, how do we know if it's worth it? What is it worth to save lives? And there's two basic approaches to valuing time or valuing lives. One is the human capital approach, which kind of makes sense on the surface. You just say, this is what people earn, and so if somebody's going to be killed and this is what they would earn, this is what their life was worth, which is maybe more useful in lawsuits where you're getting damages, or you get basic damages and then other damages on top of that. So this is actually the value of what they lost. maybe not so useful if you're talking about airbags, like how many people we'd save and what would they earn, and reducing people to what they could earn would then sort of say, well, if you don't have valuable labor market skills, your life really isn't worth anything. And I shouldn't say nobody would say that, because people say all sorts of crazy stuff, but most people would not say that. But at least it's an approach, at least, because how do you value life? You can't, if you just say every life is infinitely valuable, then we would never do anything, right? We wouldn't have cars, we wouldn't have airplanes, we wouldn't have, all sorts of things. So that's one way to approach it. Another is, and this is actually fairly popular, or gets used a fair amount, this revealed preference approach, where you say, we can see how much people value their lives by watching their behavior. If you're going to be a construction worker and you could stay on the ground and get paid this much, or you could go up and work on the 20th story and increase your risk of death by 5%, how much more do we have to pay you to go to the 20th story? And if we see this is how much you have to be paid to increase your risk of death by 5%, we can extrapolate that to what's the value of your life. It still is not, it's not perfect, but you, like, what are you willing to pay to have safer cars? If you're willing to pay a lot to have safer cars, clearly you're valuing your life. And so from airbags to, what people, just their behavior, their willingness to take risky behaviors like smoking, there's all sorts of revealed preference studies that have happened that have put in today's dollars, at, I'm going to say roughly, because the last time I looked at it in present value, it was 9.5 million. So by now it's probably about 10 million. $10 million value of a life. There's a big range on that. So it'd be sort of like maybe 6 to 13 million. These are very rough numbers, but just giving you a general idea. So there's no concrete, but basically if we value life at something around 10 million, that would be from a revealed preference approach when we're making, and it sounds awful, right? But if we're trying to say, should we undertake this policy that is going to cost money but save lives? Should we spend all the money in the world to save one life? We don't do that. We have to make that decision. And so we do have these valuations. But again, this isn't exhaustive. This is just to get you thinking that when we do cost benefit analysis, and particularly when you see hard numbers, it's important to think about what's underlying the determination of those numbers. It may look very objective because it's numerical, but if we're talking about natural resources or saving lives or saving time, what's it worth to have another lane on the freeway? You're saving everybody an hour of time. Is it, if you make $20 an hour, is that hour of time worth $20? And if you make $100 an hour, it's worth $100? When you're both getting home to see your family an hour earlier. So if I make only $20, me seeing my family for an extra hour is worth less than you seeing your family for an extra hour. It's complicated and it's not perfect, but if we're trying to measure and we're trying to make decisions, somehow we have to make these measures. And so the idea here is just to emphasize that it's not perfect, and there is a lot of room for subjective interpretation of valuations when we're doing cost benefit analysis. And one last thing that I wanted to mention is, when we're doing cost benefit analysis, is distributional concerns. You have to think about who's being benefited and who is being hurt, right? So if the benefits all accrue to some group that already has a bunch, and the costs all accrue to some group that already has almost nothing, is that really a good policy, even if the benefits outweigh the costs? Again, is it a good policy? That's a normative statement. But you can't just look at, here we finally found a way to even if we did value everything appropriately, even if it was an accurate reflection, we have to say, here's the benefits, here's the cost. Just because the total benefits outweigh the total cost, we also need to think about who the benefits and the cost are accruing to, and think about, and again, equity is a normative thing, but think about, is that fair from a distributional equity standpoint? Again, no right answers, but things that you should always keep in the back of your mind. If you're doing a benefit cost analysis, or if you're working for a firm where it's happening, or if you're evaluating a policy where it's happening, just keep in mind that when things look concrete, there's often a lot of subjectivity, and it's useful, valuable, important, necessary to understand what's going on behind those numbers.